Okay. All right. So our first speaker is going to be Sam. He has spoken at Angular San Diego in the past. We're really excited to have him back here again. His talk is about building a learning system. This is going to be a great talk for anyone, not just Angular developers. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sam.
Thank you very much. All right. I am very happy to be here. Let me just get my screen shared. Cool, cool, cool. And awesome. So let's get my screen shared there. Actually, here. Sorry, I've got to start this over. This always happens. Keynote does weird things and then takes over the whole system, and I have to start it over. Okay. For realsies now. Cool, cool, cool. Okay. Thank you for your patience. So last time I was here, I talked about authentication in NGRX, and this is a wildly and radically different topic. This is about building a learning system, how to level yourself up, level up your skills predictably and repeatably. So I'm a self-taught developer, and I got my first job in my first proper job in 2014. And then in 2018, I moved from full stack dev work to developer relations and became I worked first in content and then became a developer advocate and started speaking and things like that. And both the content side and the developer advocacy side are really fun. You get to get paid to learn and go talk to people and all of that. So I'm very grateful for this job. It's one of my very happiest things to do, but it does lead to some interesting problems. One of which is that you're sort of always on this hamster wheel of trying to chase new shiny tech around and write articles or make talks or things like that. And as you're going from technology to technology and you're learning new things, you start to kind of wonder if you're actually getting any better as a developer or if you're just sort of bouncing around uh, learning things that don't really matter. And you start kind of questioning, like, are the things that I'm learning, are they actually useful in the real world? Am I just in this like tutorial fantasy land? How do I keep learning without getting burnt out? And so as I was pondering this over the last year, it occurred to me that this is exactly the same thing that I went through when I was learning how to code, constantly trying to figure out what to learn. How do I know if I'm learning something that's useful or not? And then just all of the cognitive overhead that it took to learn all these different things. So I kind of been going back around and putting together things that I've learned for how to learn consistently practical things without getting burned out. And that's what this whole talk is about. So in this talk, we're going to talk about things like the value of a systematic approach to learning. We're going to talk about the ingredients to predictable and repeatable growth. And we're going to talk about practical tips, step-by-step tips on building your learning system. So my name is Sam Julien. I am actually a manager of developer relations at Auth0. I have a team of 6 developer advocates around the world that are all wonderful and amazing. And I wrote a book called Getting Started in Developer Relations. I make courses for Thinkster and Egghead. And then I also, probably the main thing that I'm kind of focusing on outside of work these days is the Developer Micro Skills newsletter, where I send out a practical way to improve as a developer or a developer advocate each week. And you can find all of that stuff at samjulien.com. But so when it comes to these things, I like to call them, I heard there's somebody named April Wenzel who has this organization called Compassionate Coding, and she calls what are traditionally called soft skills, she calls catalytic skills. So I really like that term. But so when it comes to these kinds of talks, I really want them to be practical and helpful and useful. So if you try these things out in the world and something works and something doesn't work, feel free to let me know, because I'm constantly refining this material to help to be actually useful and practical, and not just me talking into the void for some amount of time. So feedback is always welcome. So let's talk about first the need for a learning system. And the key word here is system. So often learning to code, whether you're just getting started or you're years and years in, the development constantly has this cycle of feeling really overwhelming because you're constantly having to learn. And on the one hand, that's something we love about coding, is that we're constantly learning, but at the same time, it can be really overwhelming. It can be overwhelming to know just what to learn. How do I know which language to pick or which framework to pick or whatever? It can feel really difficult to cross things off the list when you're learning. There's probably all of us have this list somewhere, whether it's in our head or a Google Doc or something else, just the ongoing running list of things that we want to learn. And it feels really difficult to feel like you're ever making progress on that list. It's also often really unclear what's useful to learn, because there's sort of a lack of context. You might have like a pile of unfinished courses or books or something like that, and you're kind of trying to figure out what's going to actually be useful for either getting a job or getting a better job or getting better at the job you're at. And sometimes you're also thinking like, am I actually getting better at coding, or am I getting better at doing tutorials? And so these things all kind of come into play. And one thing that really helps people to kind of shift their mindset on this is a lot of the time we approach development and learning to code as a dictionary that we have to memorize, right? We have to memorize a bunch of syntax or um, jargon vocabulary words about build systems and uh, the DOM and things like that. And that can get really overwhelming because you're just sort of trying to plow through learning all this syntax and definitions and stuff like that. It's helpful to shift your perspective, and instead of thinking like of coding as a dictionary, start thinking more like an explorer. Think of coding like a big map to explore. Similar to how if you this happens to be from Zelda Link to the Past, but if you've played any sort of game with a map, or even if you've just traveling in real life, um, you don't always get the whole map all at once, right? There's often portions of the map that are shadowed out until you go and explore it. And if you go to a new city, you might not have a good feel for what's around you. And learning to code is a really similar kind of thing. You're kind of delving into these different areas and kind of learning the territory and learning the landscape of a particular area of programming. And you're going to tread the same ground a lot of times. You also don't know the whole story all at once. And this can also be a benefit as you're learning to code. So there's a key distinction here when I use the word exploring. I don't necessarily mean wandering, because wandering tends to mean getting lost a lot of times. You make a lot less progress when you're wandering aimlessly. A few years ago, when I first moved to Portland, I guess that's not a few years, that was like six or 7 years ago. But I moved from the South, so I hadn't done a bunch of like outdoor activity because the South is just really, really hot all the time. We don't have the perfect weather of San Diego. Uh, and so I was taking all these outdoor classes and like learning to hike and camp and backpack and things like that. And I took this one navigation class, and we did this exercise where we had to try to like navigate by our intuition and then compare it to what the compass said. And it was amazing how badly like intuitive navigating is, because we've evolved to recognize patterns. And so we start seeing all these like signs in the woods of like, oh, I think I've seen this stick before. And so we just tend to get lost. Whereas if you're exploring, you have more purpose. So we're conditioned and have evolved to seek out comfort and familiarity because of our pattern matching. The problem is that being comfortable also means you're not growing. One kind of like good example of this is that common phenomenon when you've been driving home from work so many times in a year that you will get into your car and just sort of like check out, and before you know it, all of a sudden you're home, and you've just done it through muscle memory somehow. And this is kind of that same process of we're just sort of in our comfort zone, we've checked out, and there's no thought or change required. Now, you're probably thinking, hold on a second. You just like 4 minutes ago said that learning to code is really overwhelming. And now you're telling me that I'm like in my comfort zone and I'm not like pushing myself. And you're right about that. But the resistance that you feel when you're really overwhelmed is coming from that inner pull to remain as you are, because growth is really uncomfortable. And so what happens? We get really overwhelmed, and we try to kind of like make ourselves like pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and like gin up a bunch of motivation. And that might work temporarily, but then it goes away and we go back to feeling overwhelmed or paralyzed, and we don't want to get anything done. And so the way that we can overcome that is by building a system. A system is always better than motivation. Again, when I moved to Portland back a while ago, my tendency was, it was a brand new place. I didn't know anybody. I had lived in Florida for like 12 years. And so I kind of wanted to just like stay in and do nothing, but I also didn't want to. So I made this kind of like nerdy systematic approach to getting out, forcing myself to get out of the house by like, I would pick something that I wanted to do, like a bagel shop or a music store or something. And I would just like figure out how to get there. I didn't have a car when I first moved out. So I'd figure out the bus system to get up to that part of town. And that would just be my way to like systematically explore the city. Like after I'd go to that place, I'd wander around and I'd explore that little part of the city. So like this picture, it's from a place called Control Voltage in North Portland. That's a synthesizer store. And so I went to this place and then I wandered around that part of town. And it was a good way for me to kind of explore Portland in a systematic way. Now, before I keep going, I have to add a caveat here, because when I talk about like comfort being the enemy of growth or something like that, I don't want you to think that I'm going down this like hustle culture kind of mentality. I'm more talking about intellectual discomfort for the sake of personal growth. So I'm not telling you like, well, you just need to work harder. So what I want is for you to be able to be more effective in however much time you have. Like if you're, whether you're, learning to code a few hours at night, or you're, employed on the job and you have a certain amount of time that is allotted for your education or whatever, I just want to help you get more effective in that time that you have. I don't think you need to be, coding 24/7 or anything like that. James Clear in the book Atomic Habits says, we don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. So systematic approach to learning. So what does that look like? Well, there's a number of things that make for an effective learning system. Things that contribute to knowing that what you're learning is useful and that you're actually making progress and that you're accomplishing the goals that you're after. So the good news is, if you are working in a development job right now, you already have some version of this in place, because you're probably getting tasked with things that are somewhat challenging and you have no choice but to work on them. And so you have this built-in accountability system. And so this may not feel very glamorous, or you may not notice that you're growing, but just the fact that you're systematically every single day having to work on something is actually improving you a lot more than you realize. So I know often we feel this like sense of guilt that I have to do my day job and also like learn a new language on the side or something. And we feel like that's keeping us back. But in reality, the bulk of your day job is actually doing a lot of the heavy lifting for you. If you don't have a day job, or if you like to spend more time on education than just what you can do in your day job, then this is kind of geared towards that. So what we're looking for is predictable and repeatable growth. And so in order to do that, we need to understand what causes us to grow. And it turns out there's kind of a process for this that people have been figuring out over the last several thousand years. And one key aspect of that is that we grow by doing really challenging things quickly, or not necessarily really challenging, but getting uncomfortably challenged very quickly, and then getting feedback on that. So let's break that down. Doing challenging things quickly. What do I mean by that? If you think about lifting weights or performing in either like a musical performance or an athletic performance or something like that, then you've experienced this phenomenon before where you have to have this period of concentration where you can't simultaneously question yourself. There's too much on the line for you to second guess yourself as you're performing, because you need a certain level of concentration or focus or physical strength or something like that. So you've probably experienced this at some point in your life, but we often don't then apply that to these kind of intellectual tasks of coding or writing or things like that. So if you're used to taking a bunch of notes on courses or tutorials or something like that and feeling like you're constantly lost, this might be the puzzle piece. And so there's ways that you can simulate this kind of thing. When you build a learning system, you want something that's going to let you track your progress. You're going to want something that lets you measure your progress, as in, where am I at in this process? How do I know whether I'm being successful? And then you're going to want something that is production focused. You need to be able to ship deliverable things like websites or projects or articles or videos, wherever you're at in your learning process. So when you're building out your little learning system, these are the kinds of things you want to build into that system. And then the second half of that was getting feedback. So doing challenging things quickly and getting feedback, because if we are just doing things that are hard, but we're not getting any sort of outside input from other people, we might go off of a deep end that we're not intending. So this is a tricky part of this process, but it's also really critical, because you need some outside input and accountability. So first of all, the first outside layer of feedback is just going to be, does the thing do what you're hoping it would? Like, so that's the nice thing about code, is it either works or it doesn't, or it throws errors, or it has the feature that you want, or there's a blog post is either published or unpublished. So things like that, where just that in and of itself is giving you some amount of feedback. The next thing you can do, though, is you can work on learning in groups. So you can find, there's obviously you're in a group right now, so you can learn in groups. You can also do something kind of like a learning cohort, where you get a group of people together and all work through some sort of project or study subjects together. And then another great way to do this is through something called learning in public. And this can just be something like, you learn something at work. It doesn't have to be huge or life-changing, but you learn some facet of something at work and you wrote a quick little blog post about it. And if you did that regularly, if you did that even once a week, you'd have 50 blog posts a year, just kind of documenting your progress, and people would let you know whether you're doing something right, or you would just learn in and of yourself by going back and rereading those kinds of things. So those are sort of the two primary things that you're wanting to build into your learning system, but there's some other things that might help you as you're putting this together. one thing that you want is you need something that's going to accommodate different depths of learning. Now, you don't have to worry too much about this, educational taxonomy kind of thing, but I like these graphs. I like these visuals to help us understand the different levels of knowledge and understanding when you're learning something. Because in the beginning, you're just sort of remembering, kind of like you first memorized the syntax of what you're doing. And then gradually your understanding gets deeper and more sophisticated to where over time, you're not just kind of copying and pasting tutorial code to kind of make something work, but you're starting to think strategically about like, oh, why do I use this technology instead of that one? Or why did I use this naming structure instead of this one? And so that's one thing that you want to accommodate or account for as you're building this learning system. This is another educational principle, Webb's depth of knowledge, but it's the same kind of thing, but just cast a different way. So you might start out by just kind of learning the basics of something, and then gradually you're working again to more of a deeper understanding of why you're doing something. How do I scale this? How do I account for errors? Things like that. You're also going to need a learning system that works with your style of learning. This is one of those weird gatekeepy areas that tends to come up every so often of like, you should only learn through tutorials or videos or whatever, but you might be a visual learner or a spatial learner or a linear learner. I myself am very practical, very hands-on. So rather than fighting that, just embrace it and do whatever works for you. And then lastly, you're going to need some element of fun. No matter how practical or useful something might be to learn, if you're not interested in it, then don't force yourself unless somebody's paying you to learn it. So don't feel guilty about not learning something just because you think it's, what all the cool kids are doing or something like that. Okay, so let's get more practical and look at the components, like the actual pieces of a learning system. And this is the part of the talk where this is sort of, these are my suggestions, and there are sort of principles that work for this, but you don't have to replicate exactly what I'm doing. You can, of course, use whatever tools make sense for you. One thing you're really going to need is an inbox for each learning area, or you could think of this as like a notebook for each learning area. And this is something that has been really useful for me, is that I keep all of my notes on, React in one place, or all of my notes about this thing in AWS that I'm learning in one place. And that way I'm sort of gradually building this kind of knowledge repository. And I don't reinvent things over and over again. And this also helps us as we learn, because it helps us contextualize information faster and make connections a lot faster, because you start to remember every time you go to that inbox of notes, you start making connections of things that you've learned previously. Another really critical part of this is a regular review process. This is probably the forgotten piece, because even if you're dumping all your notes into one place for each learning area, if you never look at them again, then they're not very useful. So it's important to regularly, maybe once a week or every couple weeks or something, go back through all the things that you're learning or your projects that you're working on, and just kind of take a minute to look through things and kind of check in at where you're at. What this does, it pays off in very subtle ways, and then you realize how much it's helping. But it helps in reducing the time it takes to context switch between projects, because you kind of always have this little thing in the back of your mind of saying like, oh, okay, I know where I'm at on this project. We've probably all experienced that, of like opening up some side project or something at work that we haven't worked on in a really long time. And it takes us forever. It takes us maybe 30 minutes just like going back through the code or notes or something like that to like even remember where we're at. And so if instead you're just sort of periodically just glancing at things that you're working on, you're going to drastically reduce that time that it's going to take to switch back and forth. There's a person named Tiago Forte who writes this blog called Forte Labs. And he calls this the heavy lift versus the slow burn. The heavy lift being the thing where we have completely forgotten where we're at in a project. So we take 30 minutes or an hour of having to completely remember every little detail about it, versus this slow burn of continuously just like a few minutes a week, just checking in on something to see where we're at in the process. You're also going to need a reliable project management system of some kind. That could be in paper or applications or things like that, but you need somewhere to keep new project ideas, and then some process to make sure that you're actually getting things completed and shipped, basically. Uh, a really important and helpful distinction to make here is you want to distinguish between a learning area or like a goal area versus an actual project. The learning area is like the broad subject, whereas the project is something tangible and shippable that you can actually track. And this is another thing that can really help you as you're learning. If you just have this constant goal of like, oh, I want to learn JavaScript or Rust or whatever, uh, then it's going to be very hard to know whether you're making any progress. Where if you say like, okay, well, this week I want to learn how I can display my name on the page, or I want to learn how to build a command line tool or something like that. That's going to be the kind of thing that you're going to want to track. A trick for this is to identify the smallest unit of work you can, and then try to get it done quickly. And then you can just kind of repeat this process. I call this a tiny experiment. And on my newsletter, I write about that kind of thing, where you kind of ship out these little things and break it down smaller and smaller. The smaller something is, the more doable it is. And so don't overlook the value of doing a really tiny project that you can actually complete, and you kind of start racking up these wins that make you happy and make you more motivated. If you get stuck on something like this, it really helps me to zoom out a level. So if I'm, for example, a while ago, I was trying to learn Vue for the first time, and I kind of overestimated my ability to just jump right into some code and start working on it. So instead of doing that, I kind of backed my way up into, okay, let me just try to like start a new project from scratch and like literally get anything to show up on the screen. And so there's sort of these different levels of, often we try to jump right into building a complex application when we're learning something new, or going into an existing code base, and that can be really difficult. And so instead you could back up and just try to solve some sort of problem with it, or write a feature with it. If that's not working for you, go a little bit smaller, do something very small with it, try to troubleshoot something. And then if that's not working, just try to get something done. What you want is just kind of that little reward of completing something that's going to make your brain happy and make you want to dive into things more. Oh, I forgot about those animations that were there. Again, the learning is the speed of the action that you're accomplishing. So if you don't get it right, just remember it's not a failure, it's a test. You just learned another piece of data of like, oh, I guess I can't do that in time. Okay, so getting even more practical when you're thinking about building out a learning system of some kind. These are going to correspond to the other things that we've talked about earlier, but you're going to want some sort of scratch pad, some sort of task manager, and then some sort of knowledge system. So a scratch pad is going to be something like Notepad++ or Google Docs or Drafts. And what you're looking for here is you're just looking for somewhere that you can jot things down. You're not necessarily concerned with having a lot of fancy features or something, but you just need to shorten the time from learning something or thinking about something to getting it out into paper or notes or something like that. You will want something that's easy to export out somewhere else, though. You're also going to want some sort of task manager. These vary a lot. Some of the popular ones are OmniFocus, Things, or Google Keep. The trick here is that you want something that works with your brain and the way you think. I'm a very like linear, like project oriented kind of thinker. And so OmniFocus works well for me. But like my wife, for example, is a totally different thinker, very different type of creativity. And trying to have her do something like that doesn't work very well. She's much more capable and productive using a different kind of tool for that. So look for something that works with your brain. The one thing that's would be really useful though is the ability to add some sort of context or tag to your projects so that you can group them together. So you can have like all of your work projects in one area and all of your non-work projects in another. And then the last tool you'll need is some sort of knowledge base. There's a whole thing online of like, you can go down a real deep rabbit hole with these knowledge management systems. So I won't go too deep into this, but you just want somewhere you can store a bunch of notes, basically. Um, the big ones right now are Roam or Notion or Evernote. There's other like smaller ones like Foam or Obsidian. But the useful thing here is if you can find an app that lets you cross link between notes, because that way you could, you could, if you're learning, let's say you're learning Rust, for example, and you have notes on how to use strings in Rust, and that relates to how to use dates in Rust, and you can link between the two, and it's going to make it easy for you to kind of piece things together. So I kind of combined all this together into something called a learning snapshot, where I organize everything out by area, and then I put the main resource that I'm using, and then list out any ancillary resources, and then I can keep all of my notes in one place. And then I use kind of boards and things like that to track my project progress. I realize that I'm sort of running low on time, so I'm going to I'll try to move a little quicker. But I personally use drafts for taking really quick notes, and then I kind of run my entire life on Notion. And Notion lets me store things, it lets me track projects, and you can customize it in a lot of ways with colors and pictures and things like that. And I'll show you that in just a second. And then I use something called OmniFocus for projects and tasks. So let me just show you that really quick, just to give you a little idea of what I do. So this is Notion, and I didn't take a lot of time to sanitize private stuff out of here. So I'm just going to show you kind of some higher level things. But I have my Notion set up to where I keep all my projects in one place, all of the areas that I'm working in. And then the resources section is sort of that like big collection of notes that I use for different things. And then I just have a kind of an archive for stuff that I'm not working on. So like if I look at my projects board, I'll show you the business one is fine to show you. I make this little Kanban board where I can, have things that I'm working on for the next couple of weeks, and I can track the status. And Notion is cool because it lets you link in different properties and things like that. And then for the learning snapshots, let me just show you that. So this is kind of cool. Notion lets you do this kind of thing where you can customize these views and things like that. So I'm spending a lot of time learning AWS these days, using this platform called A Cloud Guru. So I have links to notes here. I have kind of progress on these things, and then just a bunch of other resources that I've been keeping track of. And it's really helpful because if I go over to like the resources here, let's see, and just like click into, oh, here we go. Yeah, so I have like these notes, and you can see that there's these backlinks to these different things. Like I'm working on an AWS course for Egghead, and so I'm cross-linking between those. And then for the actual shipping of projects, I use this app called OmniFocus. And what's cool about OmniFocus is you can do all these tasks. So this is like for the Egghead course I'm working on. You could extrapolate this out to learning. I don't happen to have a learning project right now, but it lets you do things like set due dates and set context. So these are all recording tasks that I have to do. But I find OmniFocus is really good for when I have like specific tasks I need to do to ship something, to get something out the door. And then lastly, the least interesting but most useful probably is drafts. Drafts is just, it opens up a blank sheet and you can start typing, and it's really it's really quick because it doesn't try to do any sort of processing or anything. Notion is it tries to process everything that you're typing because there's a bunch of shortcuts and things. And so it's very slow to just jot things down. But I can type something in Drafts, like I write my newsletter in Drafts, and then I can export it elsewhere. So if I'm watching like a coding tutorial, I'll take all the notes in Drafts because it's quick, and then I can export those out to Notion. So again, these are the things that I've done. This has kind of evolved over a period of time. You don't have to do all of this stuff at once. In fact, it's probably best that you don't do everything all at once. But if you just try to find one or two things that you can do to kind of pull together more of what you're working on, it will tremendously pay off for you in the long run. So let me just do a quick recap before I let you go. Probably the biggest thing is just to think like an explorer when you're doing these things. And remember that building a system is going to be much more productive than just trying to constantly make yourself more motivated to learn things. The formula for growth is action plus speed plus feedback. And then for the tactics, use one inbox per learning area, keep all your notes in one place, have some sort of regular review process to keep checking in on what your projects are looking like, and have some sort of project management system to help you track the status of a project and get it out the door. And then the tools that I mentioned were a scratch pad like Drafts, a task manager, some sort of like glorified to-do list or project manager, and then a knowledge management system like Notion or Evernote, or you could use Google Docs if you wanted to, I guess.
That means if you took, your...
Oh, sorry. Somebody, I just heard something. So all of these slides and resources and things like that are at samj.im/ls-talk. I'm also super accessible through Twitter and things like that. So yeah, thank you so much. And that's it.
Thanks, Sam. That was awesome.
Yeah.
I really love that you like kind of denounce like the hustle culture of like, if you're not succeeding, you're not trying hard enough, because like that's definitely not true. So that was a great talk. Does anyone have any questions for Sam? We'll just wait a second. If you have questions, you can either put it in the chat. You can raise your hand on Zoom and we'll call on you. Whatever works for you. There's a lot of conversation about Trello and Notion while you're giving your talk.
Yeah.
A lot of fans of both.
Yeah, Trello is a good tool too. There's also like Monday.com. That's a popular one these days.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of the tips that you gave also map really well to another system I've heard of like smart